Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much indeed for coming along. Good evening to friends and colleagues who are joining us online in the West Coast of America, in Canada, in Switzerland, in Spain. It's a very good morning to colleagues, good Thursday morning to colleagues who are joining us in China and also in Australia. Thank you so much indeed for coming along. And thank you so much indeed for such a fantastic turnout, and also to Nassos for such a generous introduction. So I'm just going to get straight on with this, if this is okay. So as with all good inaugurals, you've got to start with a picture of a London bus, and some people know exactly where I'm going with this. Not just anyone, the number 73. And the number 73 is important because it goes down from Highbury and Islington in North London, all the way down King's Cross Road on Stoke Newington, and me, my dad and my brother would often catch the number 73, bail off at London St Pancras, probably into a local hostelry somewhere. But the number 73 is important because it's been 73 years since the venerable godfather of physical activity research, Sir Jerry Morris, conducted his seminal research comparing the physical activity levels of London bus drivers and London bus conductors. And Morris identified that the more physically active conductors who were up and down the stairs, taking fares, helping people off the steps, were much more physically active and therefore had a protective effect afforded to them in terms of the prevention of coronary heart disease. Morris was followed by many greats, men and women who researched in this space, Ralph Paffenbarger and his work with longshoremen or dockers, who identified that very short, intense bouts of physical activity could provide that protective effect around coronary heart disease. And they charted the course for research that was undertaken by many men and women in this space, right the way through to our current Chief Medical Officer's physical activity guidelines in 2019 that identified the convincing role of physical activity in the prevention and management of well over 20 conditions. And I'm really pleased that members of the 2019 update join us this evening. So it's great to have you here. So what's in the title? Well, physical activity not only adds years to life, it adds life to years. It's a story of maximizing human potential, of doing all the things we want and need to do in everyday life. But it's more than that. The interventions that we implement to get people active and the physical activity interventions that we implement to get people physically active, recognizing that they might be not the same thing, is really important. What needs to go into the physical activity engine? The frequency, the intensity, the time, the type, the venue, the staffing, how people get there, the tea you serve, it's got to be Yorkshire tea, of course, the cake, and so on and so forth, is about that physical activity engine, what needs to go into the design mix. So it's been great revisiting, I guess, content from really what's going into its fourth decade. My goodness, don't I start to feel old? But just kind of choosing what to talk about. And it's been fantastic reconnecting with people, in some cases after 30 years. Most recently, Jed Garbett, who gave me the first chance of lecturing at the University of Sunderland, recently got in touch. And it's been fantastic to reconnect with people. It's been incredibly difficult choosing what to talk about, but I'm going to talk about probably the most challenging piece of work I was involved in, the national evaluation of the local exercise action pilots. But it set the tone for what followed in my career. I'm joined by people who survived LEAP and live to tell the tale. Probably the most enjoyable piece of work was Premier League Health, a national programme of men's health improvement in 16 Premier League football clubs. And then what I felt just incredibly honoured to be part of, which was the CMO's physical activity guidelines. And linked to that, the role of healthcare professionals, some of our more recent work here at the University Derby in promoting activity. I'll then talk about the environment and physical activity infrastructure and conflict. Sorry, always the spoiler. But I'll finish on a positive, talking a little bit about some of our current work here at the University of Derby. And across all this, I'll talk about the key implementation factors. I'll give you a bit of the headlines around some of these projects, as well as some of the narrative around the key implementation factors. But I didn't want this just to be about the research. We are on the School of Sport and Exercise Science at the University of Derby, and we are absolutely about maximising human potential. Across our students, our partners who we work with in their local communities, our staff, teaching, research, professional practice, and across sport and exercise science, right the way through to physical activity, we are about maximising human potential. And my story is one of achieving human potential. I think it's fair to say my route through the professorship is less than conventional, and I think no one saw it coming. So I hope that maybe my fairly unconventional route through the professorship might offer some inspiration to people. I will talk about some of my family informative influences that shaped my lens around physical activity in implementation. So, as Nassos mentioned, whilst I was born in Middlesbrough, my dad was a Geordie, my mum was a Smoggy from Middlesbrough, and he was keen to get us back up on Tyneside. And here we are at Newcastle upon Tyne, the banks of the River Tyne, and on the north bank we have the Newcastle quayside. I think some of us have had a night out there on Newcastle's quayside. And of course, on the cultural side, on the Gateshead side, we have the Baltic and the Sage and the magnificent 7 bridges across the Tyne. But it didn't always look like that. 100 years ago, the quayside looked very, very different. And my route through the professorship started nearly 100 years ago. Newcastle grew up around its industrial heritage, around shipbuilding, and that was inextricably linked with coal, the export of coal from the Northumberland coal field. And sea and coal would become important influences in my life and kind of shaped a lot of what we did. Now, let me introduce you to another influential man in my life. This is my dad, Ken. Now, some of you know Ken. You've been for a drink with him. You may well have even been to football and lived to survive the tale. So Ken was born in Newcastle in 1931. Very, very impoverished background. He grew up during the Great Depression. He remembers the Jarrow marches. And he was evacuated out of Newcastle to the countryside during the Second World War. And it's there he learns his early engineering skills because he grew up on a farm, and that's where he began to get develop his engineering skills. Upon return at the Tyneside, he became a mining surveyor. But he didn't really like the subterranean nature of the work. So his friend then blagged him onto a coaster, going out of the port of Tyne with household coal. And it's there he learned his skills as a marine engineer, working his way up to first engineer. And this is the sort of thing he worked on. Great big Herculean engines. He would work on them at sea. When we'd strip engines down, he'd work on them at dry dock, but he just got it. He had that vision about what the engine was, what were the constituent parts, what needed to go into it, how do you make them work. Now, when I left school in Alnwick in 1985, I think it's fair to say that the country was in a time of change, and I think the decline of the traditional manufacturing industrial base meant really prospects for young men and women were somewhat bleak, really. But like a lot of young men and women at the time, they followed their parents into their profession, their parents' profession, and I was no different. So I dragged my sorry backside into the central station in Newcastle. Down the Westgate Road, this building here to the left is Irvine House, where I was interviewed for my apprenticeship with British Rail as a traction trainee. Now, traction trainees learn to fix trains or they learn to drive them. There's a lovely picture here taken by my very good friend Dave Stacey, who joins this evening, of the British Rail Engineering Works in Derby. This is the area that's occupied by Derby College now. But I was just terrible at STEM subjects, so I didn't get taken on. And I did get taken on by Dave, who was building and engineering, working out of this blacksmith in Northumberland. But I was really terrible at the job, and he said, "I'm sorry, son, I'm going to have to let you go." And my dad said, "Well, you never paid you for that bank holiday, so I wouldn't worry about it, son." Now, I left school without any O levels or GCSEs and new money. So it did give me the opportunity to go back to school. And I had some great teachers who knew I was interested in sport, and they kind of harnessed my potential. I was very grateful for what they did. But it raised the prospect of going to college. The first person in my family to go to college. And this austere-looking building here is affectionately known as Asherton Tech. So this is set up by the Coal Board for miners and their families to get some education. But then it raised the prospect of going to university. And in 1988, I set sail for Stoke-on-Trent, just 30 miles up the road. I started a BA Honours in Sport Recreation Studies. I was predominantly interested in sport, but I had some great tutors. Tom Mercer, Nigel Gleeson, who went on to be profs at Queen Margaret's University in Edinburgh. How do you get people physically active? What are the best interventions? How do you design them? What needs to go into the mix? And by the time I'd left Staffs Poly in 1991, I had a choice of a job, funny enough, in Wales, as following my dad's footsteps as a health promotion officer. Or I had a funded postgraduate diploma in health education at the University of Manchester with a local authority grant, remember then. So thanks to Northumberland County Council for kind of providing the money for that. And by the time I left there, as you can see, the buildings got better and better. I washed up in my birthplace. Here we are on the Tees and the magnificent Transporter Bridge, the Middlesbrough Transporter Bridge. On the north bank of the river, we've got County Durham. And on the south bank of the river, we've got North Yorkshire. But then it was very much Middlesbrough and Cleveland. And one of the first, so got a job as a health promotion officer working in the health authority. They said, Andy, you can do anything you want. Just do it in East Middlesbrough, which was the area where the football stadium is, kind of that sort of area, the riverside. So one of the first projects I worked on was in South Middlesbrough, of course. And one of the first calls I made was to my very good friend, Stephen Robson, who worked for Middlesbrough Council Sports Development Unit. And we set up Healthy Hamilton, which is a suite of taster programs to get people who are sedentary or inactive doing some activity. And we began to pore over. We spent hours thinking about how do you design the intervention? What needs to go into the intervention mix? What about the venue, the staffing? What about the activity? How are people going to find out about this? So we spent loads of time kind of thinking about the key design characteristics. But at that time, a lovely kind of letter in the BMJ, I was talking about healthy alliances between the health and the leisure sector. And there was a lovely kind of letter in the BMJ in response to Mike Osborne. Mike Osborne set up the Oasis Project, one of the first GP exercise referral schemes in this country. In the letter they go on to say, I've argued for exercise counselling sessions to take place outside the surgery, in village halls, leisure facilities, and educational establishments. How revolutionary was that? And we were no different. And Stephen and I worked together on setting up Middlesbrough's first GP exercise referral scheme, where GPs and other healthcare professionals could refer people who are sedentary or inactive into a programme of physical activity at a local leisure centre. And we spent hours thinking about how do we put this thing together? How best do we get people's views? Do we get something up and running and use that as an operation, a means of actually having that dialogue around the key design characteristics? Now, I didn't do an undergraduate dissertation, and my first really foray into doing research and evaluation was when I did my Masters in Health Promotion, where I evaluated the GAP scheme. That would become quite important later on. So, in 1996, I set sail for Leeds Beckett University. Then it was Leeds Met. Here we are at the Beckett Park campus. I know some of you know the campus well. Where I joined the team as a senior lecturer in physical activity, setting up one of the first physical activity degrees. And it was very much about getting the applied practice into the curriculum. And I didn't do much research. But around 2002, some more senior colleagues had secured the contract to evaluate the national evaluation of the local exercise action pilots. And this is the most challenging piece of work I've been involved in. And I'm joined by colleagues who are part of this and live to survive and tell the tale. So LEAP was set up by Sport England, the Department of Health and Countryside to establish which are the most effective interventions for getting people active. What are the most cost-effective ways of doing that? And how do we put that in practice? And the findings would inform how £50 million that was set aside in the Choosing Health white paper would be spent on physical activity. So no pressure. And I probably, didn't appreciate the gravity it kind of associated with kind of this piece of work. Now, having said that, I didn't really hadn't done much research, and my first experience was doing a master's dissertation. I very soon found myself managing this multi-million-pound national evaluation across 10 sites, and there was pressure at every single level, from cabinet minister all the way down to the sites. And what you saw was the pressure coming down the line to deliver. So this was a classic mixed methods national evaluation. So we looked at effectiveness, so change in physical activity levels. We use self-report, but clearly we'd use objective measures now. Efficiency, so we inbuilt a cost effectiveness analysis to identify which interventions were cost effective in getting people active, what were the potential savings to the NHS. And if that was not enough, we did 300 interviews with key stakeholders. I kind of think we probably overdid it there, around the key implementation characteristics, so the design factors. And if that was not enough, we got Ipsos Mori to do a community-wide survey. And thrown in for good measure, we also interviewed the delivery managers on the evaluation around evaluability. So a particularly ambitious piece of work. So I'll give you the headlines, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the key design characteristics. So the headlines were, LEAP was set up to look at which interventions got people who were sedentary or inactive doing some physical activity. Yeah, 60% of the people who were recruited reported meeting the guidelines already. So we questioned to what extent it had been successful. That said, 40% weren't, and 28% of those increased their physical activity category. So there was kind of a fairly positive story there. And then when we look at the cost, the economic evaluation, the cost per participant who improved one category ranged from 260 quid to just short of £3,000. So cost effective, and the cost per quality adjusted life year gain. So that's a year lived free of disease. So in this case, coronary heart disease, type 2 diabetes, depression and colon cancer was between 50 quid and £510. So cost effective with potential savings to the NHS. So when the public health minister stood up at the Emirates Stadium, there was a positive story to tell. But what about some of the key implementation factors? Well, from our 300 interviews, I think we probably overdid it a little bit. These were some of the headlines around key implementation. So what needed to go into the kind of design of interventions to make them work. So dialogue with stakeholders, working in partnerships, a strategic approach, outreach work with local groups, tailoring the intervention to needs, understanding some of those barriers and determinants, familiar in local environments for delivering that, trained and skillful staff, building capacity, evaluation. Well, probably nothing new by today's standard. So I'm just going to pick out a couple of things which then lead us into the next section. So the first thing to say is that dialogue with stakeholders is just so important. And there's a lot is made of that in contemporary physical activity interventions now. And that's great. But it's nothing new. It's been called for well over 4 decades. But it's great, it's acknowledged, it's been important. And what's fantastic is the acknowledgement of qualitative inquiry, having a chat with people about their likes, dislikes, their preferences, dispreferences, what their determinants are, as being a valid and reliable form of data capture. So it's really great that that's kind of taken on greater kind of importance, I think, in contemporary physical activity and intervention. And there were lots of amazing examples of why it was really important to have that dialogue with stakeholders. But one emerges from the Yorkshire pilot, Yorkshire Local Exercise Action Pilot. And this is in Kirklees. So if you don't know the area, this is that M62 corridor, so kind of west of Leeds, going out to Batley, Huddersfield. And we're joined by Ali, who was really important as part of that that pilot. So there's a group of South Asian women that went to an exercise to music class. They did dancing, they listened to westernized music on a regular day at a regular time. And then one morning they said, we can't come along to this session anymore because we are being put under pressure. And our male family members, our fathers, our brothers, our husbands, our partners, etc., are being put under pressure by more influential members of the community to say, what you are doing is not in line with our cultural values. But fortunately, because of the relationship between the delivery staff and the women, they were able to have that dialogue. They were able to have that conversation and to kind of identify were the barriers and what might be some of the solutions to overcome that. So the fact that they could alternate the day and alternate the time, and that they could use their own cultural music and make their own song and dance, and that was a means of actually keeping that group of women active. Now, had it not been for that dialogue, a trusted relationship between skillful staff and the participants, the means of having that conversation, tailoring the approach, we would have lost that group. But as it was a really nice example. And you don't get that out of a book, you get that from that conversation. The other thing I wanted to focus on was evaluation. And that is where I think some of the most significant learning is around the LEAP project. And I think this is relevant today, as it is relevant now as it was back in 2007. So I mentioned this was one of the most challenging pieces of work I kind of was involved in. And we should see evaluation as part of the intervention design. It's what needs to go into the intervention mix. So we should see evaluation as part of that intervention, and we should appoint evaluators at the start. One of the big challenges with LEAP was that the evaluators were appointed 9 months after the 10 delivery sites. So expectations had already been set about what the national evaluation was. And in reality, when we bowled in 9 months after the sites had been kind of appointed, the expectation on the sites as a partnership evaluation design was much greater. And I think it's fair to say they were miffed with us, to say the least. But I think the opportunities was lost, because I think if you appoint your evaluators early, you're in and you can have that regular dialogue with those stakeholders about what the evaluation is, what is possible, what are the barriers, how you might begin to overcome those. And that conversation is so important. And I think tied in with that is the importance of having skillful evaluators. And one of those skills is being able to kind of work with the delivery sites. And I think it's fair to say we had colleagues who were brilliant researchers, but they weren't very good at communicating with the sites. And so subsequently, the sites got the hump. So we had to work incredibly hard to build up the relationship and the trust between the delivery sites, and that took a long time, and we covered hundreds of miles going out to the 10 sites. We spent a lot of time in the sites trying to build up that relationship, but I think that's a really important design characteristic. By having that dialogue, you begin to think about adopting practical and validated instrumentation. So there's no point in giving someone a questionnaire if they can't read or write. And we came across people who couldn't read or write, or where English wasn't their first language, or people who had incredible concerns around surveillance of filling in a consent form. So all these were particular challenges. And I think committing the resources to the evaluation. Now, in this case, the Department of Health put in a decent amount of funding, but so often I kind of hear, Andy, can you do an evaluation? And can you do it next week? And by the way, we haven't got any money. Can maybe get a couple of students in? And whilst that might be appropriate in some circumstances, I think it is important to invest in the evaluation. So after 3.5 hard years, and it was hard years, we built up the relationship with the site. We delivered the national evaluation. I stood up at the Emirates Stadium in front of 300 people. And I was a little bit nervous tonight, but I was really nervous then. And delivered the findings. The Department of Health were happy. And we'd actually got pretty good relationships with the 10 delivery sites, the extent to which they asked us to do some follow-on work. But I think some of the most significant learning is around the evaluation, how to evaluate or how not to do that. So there are two things which came out of this. Firstly, I knew the next big gig would come along soon. And I was very much committed that we built on the learning from the evaluation and put that into practice. So more on that in a bit. But secondly, we needed to get the learning out there. And we had to work quite hard with the commissioners to kind of talk about some of the challenges and the difficulties of doing evaluation. So we did get that into the national report, the summary report. If you want to read my PhD, you see the more colourful version of kind of implementing the national evaluation and some of the challenges. But we wrote a couple of chapters and handbooks which kind of reflected some of the key learning, what to do or what not to do. Now, growing up, working in the northeast of England in the 1990s, Kevin Keegan was the manager, and really kind of getting Newcastle back up into the Premier League, into what was then now the First Division. And we've got a group of men who are engaging in injurious lifestyle behaviours. So they're drinking too much brown ale, they're having too much curd and chips, as we say in Newcastle. They're kind of not smoking, they've got an unhealthy BMI. They don't say their health behaviour is a problem. In fact, they rate their health as good. They're subsequently incubating for health problems down the line and reducing their treatment options. How do we get this group of men into health improvement interventions? Maybe we could use the hook of professional sport. Now, growing up in 3 generations of Newcastle fans, you've got to do the right thing, haven't you? You've got to follow the path, which of course is to support Manchester United, most of my family's disappointment. Now, and probably maybe to some of your disappointment as well, actually. Now, they're not going very well at the moment, I think it's fair to say, but in probably one of their most dramatic evenings in recent time. We are in 26th of May, 1999, scores of 1-1 in the Champions League final. Bayern Munich 1, Manchester United 1. Corner to Ryan Giggs into Sheringham, and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer scores. In the 92nd minute, United go on to win their 2nd European Cup, and an unprecedented then treble. And as you can tell, I'm into this, yeah? And that's the point. So can we use the power of professional sport, football, rugby, cricket, to connect with people around their health? So this is Premier League Health, the national programme of men's health improvement in 16 Premier League football clubs. And Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who's then the reserve team manager at Manchester United, at the more humble surroundings of Wythenshawe, as part of the Manchester United iteration of Premier League Health. Now, I mentioned the opportunity to do a big national evaluation and put our learning from LEAP into practice would come round quickly. And so it did. Within 18 months, we had this, again, big national evaluation. So this was funded by the Premier League Creating Chances programme, 1.6 million, which matched by 16, they're funded in 16 sites, so the Football Club Community Trust plus their partners. Focused at men 18 to 35 years, but all men really engaged the intervention. And it was very much targeted at that kind of group of men that I've mentioned. Delivered by an NHS health trainers model. So these gentlemen here are 2 of the health trainers that worked at the Newcastle United Men's Health Project. They dress in their tracksuit. If you don't know, health trainers are allied health professionals trained in behavioural change techniques. They led the men's health interventions. And they were delivered through 3 different types of interventions. So classes and groups. So here we are at the KSE Stadium filming for Match of the Day 2. Classes and groups involving physical activity, usually football, but not exclusively. Other physical activities were also done, with educational sessions grafted onto the back of those activities to raise men's awareness around health behaviours. So in this case, we've got one of the chefs at the football club showing men how to prepare more healthy snacks. So classes and groups, match day events and promotions. So here we are at Fulham with some of the activities on a match day promoting men's health awareness, but also the men's health programme. And then outreach work with local groups of men. So I mentioned the Newcastle project. So Stephen and Iqbal were working out in the west end of Newcastle with restaurateurs, taxi drivers. Now, there are at least 2 people who've been in this said establishment. So this is maybe more. This is North Ormsby Working Men's Club. North Ormsby is affectionately known as Doggy Market. So I mentioned that the health trainers, I don't know why it's called Doggy Market, but there's a man here who can tell us. Now, I mentioned the health trainers wore tracksuits, and there was a couple of the guys who were working at the Middlesbrough project had gone into Working Men's Club to raise awareness of the men's health work project as part of that outreach work. So they're in there with their club tracksuits on. At the time, Gareth Southgate was the Middlesbrough manager. So they walk in and there's a couple of guys in there getting stuck into the club beer. What are you 2 doing in here? You 2 shouldn't be in here. You've got a game tomorrow night. It's a disgrace. No wonder you're so bad. They said, we're from the Men's Health Project. But the guys would say, and they were giving out beer mats promoting the Men's Health Project. But the kit provided an icebreaker, and so therefore they were able to have that conversation. So the importance of kind of that more informal approach and the hook of sport and the hook of the football club was kind of part of kind of connected in with the group of men. So again, classic mixed methods evaluation design. We look at effectiveness and change in lifestyle behaviours, engagement. So were this group of men using health advice services? Were they going to their GP? Implementation, we didn't do 300 interviews in this case. It was much more kind of conservative. And then interviews with the men around the acceptability of the men's health intervention to try and pull out some of those key design characteristics. But here we try to layer it around the design characteristics that help men learn about the programme, start, stick with it, and if they dropped out, come back. So what about some of the headlines? Well, 10,500 men engaged the Premier League health interventions, 4.5 engaged the evaluation. So again, we got that data loss. And then we have data loss associated from demographics to adoption to change in lifestyle behaviours. But predominantly white British, but in some areas it was kind of a more diverse kind of group of men engaged. Men 18 to 44, but we had men right the way up to 79 who kind of engaged the intervention. Roughly 2/3 were employed, but 61% were fans of the host club. So you had City fans going to United, as strange as that might sound, United fans going to City, and Liverpool going to Everton, and so on and so forth. But what about change? Well, 85% of the men reported having combinations of lifestyle risk factors, but 58% said their health was good, and they didn't think they had a problem. And over half had never used the health advice service. In fact, in one of the interviews we did, we had one guy who described the symptoms of having a stroke. And he said, well, at that point, I might go and see my GP. So, and non-attenders had worse health profiles. Non-attenders of health using health advice service had worse health profiles than attenders. But we found that through intention to treat and per protocol analysis, there were improvements in a number of lifestyle behaviours. But what about the key design factors? So I've talked a bit about using the club badge, the power of football. Male-friendly communication was really important here. Football, sport, exercise, your club. It wasn't about health. It wasn't about weight loss. And particularly branded around the club itself, using some of the players to get the message across in some of the literature. The picture in the middle, here we have some of the health trainers at Manchester United. The gentleman on the far right, bottom right, is Steve Hoy, the real McCoy. He's a former professional wrestler. He just had a great relationship with the guys in a very informal kind of way and worked with them to try and improve their health. The gentleman at the top right-hand corner is Brett Hangeland. He was the men's health ambassador. He was the Fulham first team captain, and so he would be identifiable by a younger group of men. But the gentleman who's just behind him is George Cohen. Now, George Cohen was a part of the England World Cup winning team, and he was been a Fulham footballer for many years, so he would be relatable by an older generation of gentlemen. So male-friendly communication was really important. Local and familiar environments, non-clinical environments. Here we are in Middlesbrough at the Riverside, and one of the interviews, the guy said, well, you know, you could be going to the football ground, you could be going for tickets, you could be going for a shirt, or you could be going to get your kit and caboodle checked. Nobody knows. It's non-clinical, it's anonymous. And so that local familiarity, that kind of informality was also really important. And at the borough, as a number of the clubs, they used the ground for delivering some of the activities. So some of the men's health programme took place in the first team changing room where they did kickboxing. They'd run out onto the pitch. So it became quite an interesting, intriguing kind of setting for the delivery of men's health interventions. Very different from going to a GP practice. A range of physical activity options. So it wasn't just football. It was a range of modes of activity, and also the importance of the health trainers and the skills that they had. And male and female health trainers were also important in improving the health of men. So that's kind of a bit of a snapshot around it. But the findings challenged the notion that men are hard to engage or resistant to change their lifestyles. And in essence, they were hard to avoid when men's health interventions were delivered in football clubs. And there was a lovely kind of editorial that was undertaken in Public Health. Now, Public Health is the peer-reviewed journal of the Royal Society of Public Health. And John Mackie and Sim, who were the editors, wrote, Premier League Health provides a template that can and should be replicated in other sports around the world. And in a sort of roundabout way, that kind of happened really, because the findings from our work subsequently informed the second and third generation of men's health interventions and funding made available through the Premier League Creating Chances programme, a fund of over 111 million in 2014. But our outputs had also been cited in interventions which looked at men's health in ice hockey, Australian rules, as well as footballs by 25 researchers from 25 different countries. But for me, it set the tone of what followed, a programme of research around the role of football community trust as a vehicle for health improvement. So we audited health improvement across the English Football League. We replicated that in La Liga. We've worked in the East Midlands, so Burton, Nottingham Forest, and the best of the best, of course, Notts County Foundation. And Notts County Foundation connected in with Notts County FC, but an important charity in their own right, who very much try to improve the health and lives of people using the power of sport and physical activity. So it's not just physical activity, it's health improvement, it's education and engagement. And we're very much really proud to partner with Notts County Foundation. And just one of the projects we've worked on is evaluating their care programme, the cancer rehabilitation and exercise programme. So for people who have a cancer diagnosis, they can engage in a programme of physical activity delivered at the Portland Centre, which is their leisure centre run by Notts County Foundation, and engage in a programme of activity with social support. We've done a number of pieces of work. And we kind of built on this relationship. So my learned colleague, Jack Parker, who's joined us this evening, we're kind of working with Notts County Foundation and a number of other football club community trust in delivering a programme of education and physical activity for children with ADHD. So we're really proud to kind of partner. And I know Diane Jackson, our chair of trustees at Notts County Foundation, joins us online this evening. So I'll just take a quick drink of water, if I may, catch my breath. So just moving on to our physical activity guidelines. We often think of these as being fairly recent developments, but actually it was our ancient Greeks who first came up with our the importance of our physical activity guidelines. But a piece of work I was just incredibly proud to be part of, and Rob and Dave, who were also on the 2019 update, it was just a real privilege. I felt so proud to kind of be selected as part of this. So just a little bit of kind of background on this. So we have 6 expert working groups, which for the first time were made up of academics, researchers, policymakers, practitioners. So a real nice mix as part of that expert working group. And they reviewed the evidence at that point in time, right the way through from early years, children, young people, adults, older adults, sedentary behaviour, and for the first time, communication and surveillance. So previously, just before we kind of published the 2019 update, the American guidelines had been kind of circulated, and they've been criticised for the lack of information around a communication strategy. How do you get the message around the guidelines out? So it was great that we in the UK were one of the first to start thinking about how do we get the message out? What is the communication, the best way to communicate the guidelines? So the groups kind of review the evidence. There's a scientific and a kind of physical activity community kind of consultation, a number of events that took place. The technical reports are then kind of rewritten. That goes into the final report. And then typically we have a set of infographics which get the message across, but we've never really had a communication strategy. Now, Charlie Foster, who led the 2019 update and modernised, I think, the review of the guidelines, said a shift in the number of people working towards the guidelines will not happen because we have a guideline. It will happen if we genuinely invest and it's communicated. And Nanette Mitri, who led the expert working group on communication and surveillance, and every previous guideline has failed to have a communication plan. So it's good that we looked at this particular area. So I'll kind of just give you some of the headlines. No surprise, a comprehensive communication strategy is needed to get the guidelines out. And as part of that, we should have excellent social marketing. You know, as academics, we're not always great at kind of communicating the messaging. So why aren't we using expert skills around social marketing? The need for straplines and catchphrases, which are important across the physical activity continuum. So some is good, more is better. Thinking about different messages for different groups and thinking about different messaging around moderate to vigorous, strength, balance is also important. And at the time when we were working on this, mental health was across the BBC, all the platforms. So it was on TV, it was on radio, it was on the website, it was on the iPlayer, it was in the documentaries, it was in the sitcoms. We should be doing the same. We should have physical activity across every platform, multimedia, multi-channels, but to have that, it needs serious political support and proper investment. Now, I don't really think we achieved this aspiration. Well, we didn't achieve this aspiration kind of going forward, but there was some excellent work that was undertaken in Bristol and also in Edinburgh and also for the CMO's expert working group of communicating the guidelines. So we started the process. Now, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that maybe in the next 3 years, we might be into the review of the guidelines again. I think we'll be into a 24-hour guideline. It'll be physical activity, it'll be sedentary time, it'll be sleep, it'll be screen time, and it will look very different. So we really do need to think about the messaging that's associated with all those components and getting that across. So the work has been started, and I think we've got a lot to build upon going forward. So, linked to the CMO's guidelines is the importance of healthcare professionals in promoting physical activity. They are very much identified as being really important conduits for getting that message across. And in some cases, people will talk about that they will be more active if their GP encouraged them to do so. So, we often, though, see some of the criticism in the media that some healthcare professionals, some of our GPs, our nurses, our physios, our OTs, don't know all the guidelines, that they don't always feel confident in giving the information, that they are subject to incredible structural pressures around workload and time. So since coming to the University of Derby, I've kind of built on this body of work with a number of colleagues. And so just want to kind of talk a little bit about some of the barriers and facilitators that healthcare professionals face when promoting physical activity. So in the study at the top, this is Nikki Kime, Dane Vishnubala, our visiting professor in sport and exercise medicine, who joins us this evening, Stephen Spalinsky and myself. We looked at the preparedness of healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses to promote physical activity for patients with diabetes. And some of the barriers were they didn't always feel confident, particularly when it came to type 1 diabetes, and often would avoid the conversation, and felt that they often struggled with time or had poor training at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Alex Stead from the University of Leeds and Leeds Metropolitan University. Alex is a physio. This is working with Dane and also Camilla Newcar from the University of Leeds. That some of our physios didn't know all components of the physical activity guidelines. So they might have known moderate to vigorous, but didn't necessarily know what the guidelines were around sedentary time. So there's kind of work to be done there. And again, worries about being fearful about giving the wrong advice. Anoop Raghavan from the University of Leeds kind of looked at nurses' preparedness and promoting physical activity. Some of the barriers were kind of time pressures and workload and physical activity being seen as an afterthought. And then also in Dane's paper, which is with doctors, lack of patient engagement, as well as lack of knowledge around the guidelines. So these were some of the common and reoccurring barriers. And we've done similar work with midwives as well. What about some of the facilitators? Well, in Nikki's study, Nikki Kime's study, our GPs and nurses said it would be great to have knowledge of our physical activity interventions available in the community in one central place. So it's accessible. So we're not scrabbling over multiple kind of sources for information, particularly problematic when time is a pressure, as well as undergraduate and postgraduate training, CPD opportunities, Our physios talked about the importance of behavioural change techniques, goal setting, as well as, again, ongoing training, postgraduate training, CPD. And then with our nurses, they talked about the availability of online resources that are available in one place. So it's great that we've got the moving medicine resource. Dane's here. A number of our colleagues were involved in moving medicine, a suite of online resources available from the 0 minutes consultation to the more minutes consultation for a range of different conditions. And then in Dane's paper, we identified the importance of staff training at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Now, there's some great work that's gone on in this area, the Moving Healthcare Professionals Programme, in helping our healthcare professionals enhance their preparedness. So we've got undergraduate and postgraduate training in the medical curriculum. We've got the Moving Healthcare Professionals Programme, which also includes CPD, the Clinical Physical Activity Champions Programme, as well as the Moving Medicine kind of suite of resources. But it's great that we continue the conversation, because that is a key design characteristic in building up our knowledge about how we can best support what is really a really important key conduit for promoting advice and guidance on activity. So our work continues in this area. Okay, so Jackie Kerr in her book chapter often refers to the environment being the greatest barrier in physical activity. And here we have a lovely picture here on the Calder navigation in Wakefield with some paddleboarders. And it's fantastic to see some of our physical activity infrastructure being repurposed. So here we have one of our old coal mineral railways that used to take coal out of a coal mine in Barnsley, South Yorkshire for transportation. It's great. The burnt out cars have been shifted, the fridges have been moved. It's been Victorian drainage has been put in. It's wide, it's convivial, it's social. This is Bruno the dog making a cameo appearance. But there are no effects without side effects. And increasingly, some of the literature talks about conflict in the physical activity infrastructure. Now, this is not to say one group is to blame and one group isn't. This is to say that this is interesting. It's important because it has implications for intervening, and we should begin to understand this. So I know we've got a number of cyclists here in the room, but we've got conflict between cyclists and pedestrians. So in this case, this gentleman looks as if he's gone through the zebra crossing where he should have stopped, and he's been manhandled by a member of the public saying you shouldn't do that, etc. And also conflict within groups, so mechanical cyclists, e-cyclists, etc. So we've done some work as part of the active study. So actives are people who are meeting the physical activity guidelines and what helps and hinders them to keep active, particularly during COVID-19 and beyond. So we've begun to pull out some of the different layers of conflicts. And I think there's probably more that can be added here, but it ranges from disagreements and arguments to verbal and non-verbal abuse, to deliberate or unintentional obstruction of the infrastructure, then threats of danger to health and safety and acts of danger. So let's put a bit of meat on the bone here. So in this case, you can just about, in the top picture, you can just about see our cyclist who's got a helmet cam on, and he's stopped. He's done absolutely the right thing. Rather than go through what is probably a 60 or 70 metre gap between the curb and the truck, can't go anywhere, the cycle path's blocked. But what you don't see in this video here is that he's getting a load of grief from another cyclist for not going through the gap. And because it was caught on cam, the conversation continued for several miles down the road, and there was liberal exchange of Anglo-Saxon and industrial language. And that's kind of fairly commonplace, kind of in terms of how the space is being used, who's using it, when's it being used, etc. So we often see blocking and obstruction of the infrastructure. Now, in some cases, it's kind of a group of people who are cycling or walking, they're in conversation, they're having a frothy coffee, and they're just not paying attention. And subsequently, people get a little bit dissatisfied with how the infrastructure is being used. In more kind of, I suppose, sinister kind of approaches, you see objects or things being put in to obstruct the infrastructure. So in this case, we've got some branches put across. Probably one of the most sinister examples I saw was a dog being put in the way of a lady cyclist who was trying to get past on the National Cycle Network. And then when the lady outfoxed the runner, And it really peeved them off, and she shot off down the path. There was a kind of a liberal exchange of Anglo-Saxon. And then kind of you see examples like this. This path leads down at the National Cycle Network, which is for walkers and wheelers of all type. So the delivery vans come down from Hartlepool with cross the kippers to service some of the restaurants at the bottom of the bank. And they typically would reverse down on the pavement. So if you've got a wheelchair, or if you're pushing a buggy, you're forced onto the cobbles. And that's kind of difficult to get traction. So the council have subsequently put in these bollards to kind of stop them doing that. A day after I took this picture, one of these bollards had been snapped over by a truck that had just reversed down. So we've got intentional, unintentional obstruction of the infrastructure. Then threats of danger. Now, this might be cyclists riding too close to horses, dogs that are kind of out of control. The worst case I saw was 24 dogs running around as a pack, just being let out of an outhouse. So if you're pushing a pram on the National Cycle Network, that's a really scary prospect. Or if a dog jumps up on you and knocks you over. But lots of dog owners do actually control their dogs. They're very kind of considerate as well, so we need to balance that out. Probably the most interesting one I had was that I had a fishing hook. Someone had cast the line and it got stuck in my derailleur. Unintentional. And then we have kind of acts of danger. So pedestrians being knocked over by cyclists being knocked over by dogs. And this probably more sinister example whereby on an air road in South Yorkshire, the rear passengers opened the door on a cyclist at about 50 miles an hour. Now, the cyclist was okay because they shouted enough after this event. And this is not really to kind of say one group's to blame and one group isn't. It's to say this is interesting. It has implications for physical activity. You know, if you are a novice exerciser and you are using the infrastructure and you kind of have a poor experience, that takes a bit of processing and you may not come back. And even if you're an experienced exerciser, that, you know, and you've been subject to threats of violence or intimidation, then that takes a bit of dealing with as well. So this is work that continues. Okay, let's finish on some positives. Now, I mentioned the intervention doesn't necessarily have to be a physical activity intervention. Here we've just had part of the National Cycle Network, we've had some of the vegetation cut back. So it just makes it wider. So if you've got a horse and someone's on a bike, the cyclists can get out of the road. So it's just a simple way of kind of trying to make the environment a bit more accessible, a bit more manageable. Here we are in North Yorkshire and York. So you can see in the picture on the left-hand side, the path is to be used by cyclists and all sorts of wheeling and pedestrians. It's narrow. So during COVID-19, they took out one of the parking bays and used it as a pop-up cycling lane, but it was used by all sorts of wheelers. Post-COVID, they've widened the path. So there's more space. It's a little bit more better for negotiating. There's a bit more room, and they've shoved the lampposts on the other side of the car park. So just kind of simple ways of trying to change the environment. And one of my favourites, you'll see here, a picture on the left-hand side, we are 327 miles from Derby and we're in Berwick-upon-Tweed. So Berwick-upon-Tweed is equidistant between Edinburgh and Newcastle. So we're about to start our cycle journey to Derby, 327 miles. We come about 30 miles further south near Allarmouth, equidistance between Berwick and Newcastle. This is the main coastal road down through the northeast of England, now through Northumberland. The road here is 50 miles an hour. There's nowhere to walk. If you're on a bike, there's not much room. It's twisty and turny. So it's a really nice example where Sustrans have worked with a landowner to repurpose the farmland for all forms of wheeling and pedestrianisation, and it's traffic free. So that's a really nice example. Okay, and above all, physical activity should be fun. So I guess this is my opportunity to say a few thank yous before I kind of just talk about some of our current work. So very special thank you to my lovely partner, Jeanette Errington, who is still smiling, even though I've dragged her up this great big hill on the climb from Reston. Neil, you know this location really well, is still smiling, even though I've dragged her up the hill. So thank you very much. And also thank you to my siblings, Matty and Helen, who are listening in from other parts of the world tonight. And of course, my parents, Pam and Ken, who are still in the Long Beach jail. My friends from university, Rob and Ian, who very much kept my feet on the ground, and of course, my good friends from York and North Yorkshire, Neil Gibson and David Stacey, who join us this evening. Thank you to my professorial colleagues, Professor Bissas, Rob Copeland, David Broom, Catherine Woods, David Morley, and the esteemed Professor Peter Smith of the University of Sunderland, and my collaborators, Steve Zwolinsky and Nikki Kine. And I should say a very big thank you to my PE teacher, Archie Jenkins, who taught me at the Duchess's High School in Alnwick. Now, Archie put in a lot of time into young men and women who, by getting them into sport and physical recreation, including athletics. And he was a great influence on me, and he would take us to all sorts of events, particularly athletics. And when you're standing at a start line of a road race and you've got an Olympic and world champion on either side of you, it raises your aspirations of what might be possible in life. So for me, my kind of connection in around sport was about something much bigger. And then also thank you to my learned friends and colleagues who I worked with at my previous institutions, so Stephen Robson, Professor Anford and Jonathan Long, and Lindsay Dugdale, who was my external examiner for my undergraduate degree, but also my PhD, and the venerable Bob LaVenture from Later Life Training, who I've worked with for well over 3 decades and who joins us online this evening. And then my lovely colleagues here at the University of Derby, but in particular, Claire Roscoe, Sugar Zan. Sugar, I know, is listening from Hunan in China this evening. Our visiting Professor Dame Vishnu Bala, also from the University of Leeds. Jack Parker, Dr. Jack Parker, and then Andy Hooton, our head of school, who you'll hear from in a bit. So it's almost the end of the road, but not the end of the journey. And Neil Radford said there'll definitely be at least one picture of my bike. So not wanting to disappoint, we've ridden through Northumberland. We are in East Lothian, looking north towards Edinburgh. And over to the right, we've got the Kingdom of Fife. So just some examples of work that we are kind of involved in. So we've been evaluating DigiBeat, which is an app for managing type 1 diabetes by children, young people and families. We're doing some work. We've been commissioned to do some work later on this year, looking at a mental health component of the app. So that's great. The DigiBeat app has been rolled out across 163 paediatric diabetes services in this country. Working with Sugar and Claire on compassion. And we've got a paper coming out in the British Journal of Health Psychology on the role of self-compassion as a mediator for physical activity. But I also think there is something around compassion and how that can be used to manage conflict in the physical activity environment. Working with Claire's group around fundamental movement skills and physical activity levels of children and young people, but in particular, I mentioned the messaging and how we need to work on the messaging of the physical activity guidelines for particular groups. So PhD student Robert Flynn looking at messaging around how we get that messaging out to kind of families around the physical activity guidelines. What's the best way of doing that? What's the different media? And then our work continues around the understanding the promotion of physical activity with healthcare professionals, working with Dane and Camilla and other colleagues at the University of Leeds as well as lots of other projects that we are involved in. So I started out talking about my dad, Ken. And my dad was a great marine engineer. He just got it. And for me, I would have been a terrible mechanical engineer. But for me, it's just about finding your engine to work on. And the physical activity engine and the investigation into that is my engine. What needs to go into the design mix? Because that's really important in getting people physically active, which, of course, is a design for life. So thank you for listening. And, of course, keep active.